In the cold, brooding waters of the North Sea, more than 8,000 British and German sailors share a common grave. They met their fate in May 1916, at the height of the First World War. Off the east coast of Danish Jutland, the two largest battle fleets on Earth confronted each other for the first time. For little more than an hour, the fate of the world hung on ships, guns, and nerves of steel. Up against a British fleet twice its size, the German ships faced certain destruction. But as night fell, their commander, Admiral Scheer, made a brilliant escape. At battle's end, 14 British and 10 German warships lay at the bottom of the sea. Both sides claimed victory, but the Battle of Jutland had failed to bring a promised end to the war, and had shaken both countries' confidence in the battleship as the supreme arbiter of naval might. Following the Battle of Jutland, Britain remained in control of the sea lanes. But questions immediately arose as to why her all-powerful battleships had not delivered a decisive blow to the German high seas fleet.
In a sense, Jutland is an extremely good snapshot of the strengths and weaknesses of the battleship. Guns that can fire out to the horizon, being directed by the Mark I eyeball, with some optical assistance, but no radar. Ships being controlled by flag signal, as Nelson had done. So it's hardly surprising that it's very, very difficult for commanders to maintain control. It's relatively easy for fleets to get away. It is difficult to utilize this raw military strength of the battleship to bring about decisive results at the tactical and operational level. Very, very difficult, because the sensor and communications technology is not up to the job.
Germany's leaders, on the other hand, applauded their battle fleet for achieving a tactical victory against a fleet twice its size. But the Kaiser and his naval commander, Admiral Scheer, agreed the risks of another battle were too high. Moreover, further fleet action against the British offered little hope of forcing them to the peace table.
The scare of Jutland, the amazing tactical victory there, the German leadership realized the role that luck and amazing skill played in that, and that the British weren't going to let that happen a second time.
Everybody knew that even when the ships which had come back would be repaired and would be ready for war again, it would be unwise to risk such a battle again. And this was what Scheer recommended to the emperor only 4 weeks after Jutland.
Following the Battle of Jutland, the German High Command abandoned the battleship for a weapon proving far more successful in the war at sea: the U-boat. By January 1917, more than 2,000 British merchant ships had been sunk, and Britain was facing the possibility of being starved into submission. Months later, Germany started an unrestricted U-boat campaign. All vessels would be sunk without warning, even ships of neutral nations. It was these indiscriminate attacks, especially on American merchant ships, which brought about a major turning point in the conflict. On April 4th, 1917, the United States government declared war on Germany. Within a month, the first American troops embarked for Europe to make an all-out assault on the Kaiser's armies. The major challenge was to ensure their safety across the U-boat-infested waters of the North Atlantic. The new allies, Britain and America, agreed to supply naval ships to protect convoys of troopers and merchant ships. For the first time in the war, the scale of sinkings by U-boats declined dramatically.
The main thing is we take American troops to Europe and we convoy them. Old American battleships, cruisers, destroyers are used for convoy escorts, and a very large army is moved into Europe. That army proves quite decisive.
Five US battleships were also seconded to the British Grand Fleet. The USS Texas arrived in British waters in early 1918. Armed with 10 14-inch guns, she was one of America's first super dreadnoughts. With a crew of over 1,000 men, Texas was a floating city, boasting one of the finest hospitals on the high seas.
We were only allowed 4 hours ashore at a time. We were always under 4-hour standing orders, because they always hoped or expected that the German fleet would come out. And we went out quite frequently. I mean, I'd say we were out maybe 2 or 3 times a month. They'd get some rumor that there was some activity out there in the North Sea, and we'd take off and go out there and try to run them down.
Throughout 1918, the Allied blockade of Germany tightened, starving the nation of food and munitions. But for those American seamen expecting enemy action, there was disappointment. The German Navy remained a virtual prisoner of fear, rarely leaving port and allowing Britain and her allies to control the seas. In the final year of the war, the only loss of a major warship was the Sven Istvan, belonging to Germany's closest ally, Austria. As the vessel slid into the Adriatic Sea, 89 sailors perished, including the captain. The destruction of a modern dreadnought by an inexpensive torpedo boat sent shockwaves through the world's major navies. But throughout 1918, the scale and horror of land battles on the Western Front eclipsed in importance naval matters for both sides. By mid-October, Germany was negotiating with American President Wilson for a way out of the war. Then in late October 1918, British naval intelligence intercepted a German message that electrified the Admiralty. With the war all but lost, German naval staff had defiantly hatched a dramatic plan for one last sortie by their high seas fleet.
There is mounting frustration among the ship commanders at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven when they feel that all the future holds for them is to sit in a fleet inactive, which will possibly be captured or even destroyed at the piers at war's end.
Rather than surrender their ships, the officers decided to challenge the British Grand Fleet in one final battle. The desperate plan was to be kept secret from the Kaiser, but rumours quickly spread amongst the ratings.
When the word gets out among the crews that the so-called death sortie is being contemplated, and indeed approval is given by the High Command to begin preparations, there are a series of mutinies.
In one of the largest mutinies in history, the German high seas fleet stood paralysed at anchor, but this time on the order of the common sailor, not their supreme warlord.
At these times, the newspapers are full of reports that the German side wanted to have a cease-firing, and the sailors and stokers, they knew this development.
Admiral Scheer did his utmost to convince the men to fight. An honourable battle by the fleet, he said, even if it is a fight to the death, will sow the seed of a new German fleet of the future. 5 times the order to put to sea was given, and 5 times it was ignored. The German sailors had resolved to bring the war to an end. On the 9th of November, the Kaiser was told that his navy could no longer be counted loyal. It was the final straw. The following morning, with his nation on the verge of revolution and under pressure from the American president, the Kaiser sought exile in Holland. 24 hours later, the war to end all wars came to an end. The 21st of November 1918 was the most poignant moment for the Royal Navy since Nelson's victory at Trafalgar. Along with 2 squadrons of American and French battleships, the entire British Grand Fleet set sail in full fighting order into the North Sea. Their mission? To intercept the German high seas fleet. From their bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven, 91 warships of the Kaiser's beloved navy set sail for the last time.
This was, of course, something which had a deep impact on the psychology of the Naval Officer Corps. Because for them, instead of the day of victory, this was a day of shame.
At 8 a.m., the German fleet appeared out of the haze.
The thing that I remember, standing on deck and seeing all these ships come in line. I don't know how many there was quite a few of them though, but I could see that they were in a pretty run-down condition. And I don't think they'd been maintained. And it was a kind of a sad thing to see all these immense big ships come in there. But it was an overcast, dull day. And what shall we say, is a funeral day. And it was a funeral for the German Navy.
Sandwiched between two columns of Allied warships, the pride of German engineering and seamanship was escorted back to British waters.
And the victory is rubbed in. It did demonstrate the fact that the Grand Fleet had been able to keep command of the seas of the world outside the North Sea. It had been incapable of destroying the High Sea Fleet, but it had been fully capable of neutralizing it, and this ceremony symbolizes that.
Over the coming months at Versailles, the victors decided on their punishment for Germany and her allies. The peace treaty stripped Germany of land and severely restricted the size of both its army and navy.
The Germans were, for instance, forbidden to have an air force. They were to have no more submarines. Their fleet was restricted to pre-modern, pre-dreadnoughts, which, in the case of war, were useless, as everybody knew at that time.
As talks continued at Versailles, the German High Seas Fleet lay imprisoned in Scapa Flow, awaiting its fate. But the German officers feared their ships would be handed over to Britain and her allies. They set into play a daring plan, unprecedented in history.
It was midsummer, 21st of July. I was 10 years old, and 300 children were invited down to visit the fleet. Both the British fleet and the German fleet were lying in Scapa Flow. And we went down with sail in the pathway between the ships so that we got a very good view of the ships. We had been warned by the teachers that we hadn't to make any noise or cheer. And on our way down, we got a message from another ship which said that the British fleet had gone out that morning for exercise and that they were not returning until they had got this amazing news, which of course was that the German fleet was sinking.
Just after midday, the German crews scuttled their ships.
They stood an end on their bows, they went over, they dived, they sank low, they rose in the water. I myself saw 12 capital ships go down. I'll never forget the sight of it.
"52 ships went to the bottom that day. German honour salvaged by the greatest act of self-destruction in maritime history. But to Admiral von Tirpitz, the architect of the fleet, the scuttling couldn't salvage Germany's dream of a global empire. "The German people do not understand the sea," he wrote. "In the hour of our destiny, we did not use our fleet. Whether our grandsons will be able to take up the task again lies hidden in the darkness of the future." After 4 long years, war weariness was slowly replaced by unbridled optimism and zest for life. For the British Royal Navy, now was the time to take stock and plan for the future. But with the German fleet lying at the bottom of Scapa Flow, The British Parliament told Admiralty that the Royal Navy was too large for peacetime. More than 100 outmoded warships, including the once revolutionary dreadnought, were sold for scrap. The United States, however, embarked on a different course. Now the world's leading industrial nation, she deliberately set out to displace Britain as the dominant naval power. By 1921, American yards were constructing 6 enormous battle cruisers and 12 of the largest and most powerful battleships ever designed. Once completed, they would outclass all existing capital ships and threaten the balance of global power. In the Far East, Japan watched America's naval build-up with unease. During the First World War, Japan had aligned itself with Britain and America against Germany. But after the war, Japan saw the United States as the main obstacle to her growing power in the Asia-Pacific region.
Japan is obviously the single most powerful naval nation in the West Pacific and East Asia. The other great Pacific power, of course, is the United States. It is not unnatural, therefore, that the two navies begin looking at each other, even though the interests of the two nations are not grossly antithetical. Nevertheless, the two naval establishments begin to see in a very hypothetical sense, yeah, that fellow over there may give us problems in the future.
For its origins and traditions, the Japanese Imperial Navy had looked to Britain. Her naval officers were sent to Britain for training, and British shipyards supplied Japan with a majority of her battleships. But now Japan was determined to stake its claim in Asia and secure it with its own homegrown battle fleet.
And we see the laying down of a series of Japanese capital ships, which at the time that they were launched were simply more powerful, more heavily armed than anything else afloat.
America's naval build-up was also viewed with suspicion in Britain.
After the First World War, the main enemy for war planning becomes America. There is a committee that looks into the future of the battleship in Britain, and all the scenario planning is done with America as the enemy. Reads a little strangely now.
The assumption was that trade caused wars, and there would be a big competition for world trade. The United States was the greatest economic power in the world. The British would obviously resist us, and so there might be some explosion. Except that those who would write these things never quite explained how this explosion would ever happen.
By the early 1920s, Britain was embroiled in a new and expensive arms race, one she could neither afford nor afford to lose. The magnificent HMS Hood, completed in 1920, reassured Britons the Royal Navy could rally to the challenge. With her 8 15-inch guns and an extraordinary maximum speed of 31 knots, Hood blended the firepower of a battleship with the speed of a battlecruiser. But Hood was designed in 1915, a year before the Battle of Jutland. America's new ships, however, were designed after Jutland and reflected the hard-won lessons of that battle.
Ships of greater firepower, of greater protection than any existing British warship. So the plans of the American Navy would lead to a battle fleet vastly superior to the British if the British didn't rebuild their battle fleet.
With America building superior ships, British Admiralty called for even larger, heavily armoured and faster vessels, mounting super guns of up to 18 inches. But the triumphant allies of the Great War appeared totally blind to their folly. Battleships were the most expensive weapons on Earth, yet in the entire 4 years of hostilities, they had confronted each other in only one battle, and for little more than a single hour. Now they were the focus of a new arms race, a contest that could bankrupt nations and spark a new global catastrophe. Suddenly in 1921, American politicians had second thoughts. US Secretary of State Charles Evans Hughes called for a conference to be held in Washington and attended by the 5 major naval powers. Its primary focus, arms limitation of the battleship.
Here we see battleships as symbols because if you're going to disarm or limit armaments, what better way to make that case than to get rid of battleships or not to build new ones?
And basically what happens at this conference is that the Americans say, look, none of us want a naval race, do we, really? Let's agree to cut back our programs to a point where we and the British have parity and where the Japanese have 3/5 of the individual strength of Britain and America to protect their own sphere in the Pacific. The magic 5-5-3 ratio.
The Washington Conference was unprecedented, both in its aims and results. The major naval powers agreed to a dramatic reduction in the quantity, firepower, and size of their capital ships. The American Navy would destroy 4 existing dreadnoughts and 17 under construction. The Royal Navy would scrap 22 existing dreadnoughts and 4 partly built battlecruisers. But the most surprising outcome was Japan's agreement to limit its fleet to 60% the tonnage of both the US and British battle fleets, even though hardliners in the Imperial Navy believed the treaty an affront to Japan's ambitions.
ところが逆に言うと日本の場合はあの時はもう国家予算の40何%ですか、あれをずっと88艦艇を全部作ってたらもう国家がバンクラフトしそうな勢いだったために、あの時は完全に日本の場合シビリアンコードを聞きましてね、そしてワシントン条約をOKした。
Even small navies were victims of the agreement. The flagship of the fledgling Australian Navy, the battlecruiser Australia, was considered a British ship. In April 1924, she was scuttled off Sydney Heads. But in the end, it was Britain which lost on the deal. With the stroke of a pen, she surrendered her long-standing supremacy of the seas. But by sharing the balance of power with America, she avoided an unrestricted arms race she could barely afford.
So therefore, Washington caps this arms race, an arms race which, if it hadn't been capped, could have had some quite serious effects. It's often said as a criticism of Washington that Washington didn't prevent Pearl Harbor, Washington didn't prevent World War II. Well, of course it didn't. But it perhaps prevented the great Anglo-American War of 1928.
The Washington Treaty was universally welcomed. Diplomacy had brought an end to the spiralling arms race and fostered a new sense of global security, at least for the 10-year term of the agreement. But in military circles, debate continued over the strategic value of battleships in modern war. In 1921, United States Army aviator General Billy Mitchell made the controversial suggestion that the battleship was obsolete. In future wars, he said, aircraft would prove the dominant weapon. He called for the United States to create an air force separate from the Navy and Army because they were too conservative and surface-oriented. To prove his point, he challenged the Navy to a showdown between the bomber and the battleship.
In some circles, he was viewed as brilliant and visionary. In other circles, he was viewed as an eccentric and a crackpot. He arranged bombing tests by land-based aircraft. And his idea was that fleets and armies were no longer relevant, that strategic bombing could accomplish all that one wanted to in the way of warfare.
In his most controversial demonstration, Mitchell set out to destroy an old German dreadnought, the Ostfriesland. After numerous unsuccessful bombing raids against the stationary target, Mitchell defied his commanders and ordered his pilots to pound the battleship until it succumbed.
Which proved that an old German battleship with no damage control, stopped in the water and with no anti-aircraft guns, could be sunk by bombers, to which the Navy could only say, big deal. It proved very little.
Billy Mitchell didn't get his independent air force. Instead, he was court-martialed 4 years later for insubordination. But Mitchell had given the world's navies a glimpse of a technology that would continue to evolve, while the battleships stagnated under the Washington Treaty. For the victors of the Great War, the 1920s delivered peace and stability. But for vanquished Germany, it meant humiliation and bankruptcy. The Treaty of Versailles had left the nation's political and economic life in disarray. By the end of the decade, the harsh war reparations and a worldwide economic crisis had plunged Germany into depression.
The German political and economic situation today is extremely difficult. This is the result not only of having lost the World War, but above all the outcome of the fact that Germany's former enemies are oppressing her above endurance.
When the German government complained it was too poor to pay its war debt, American banks agreed to generous loans. Funds it channeled into rebuilding German industry and national pride. But some of the loans were siphoned into a controversial series of warships. The Deutschland, Admiral Graf Spee and Admiral Scheer were the size of cruisers, but built in battleship fashion. And at 14,000 tons, well over the 10,000-ton limit dictated by the peace treaty. The British press sounded the alarm, calling them pocket battleships. Their stated purpose was to serve as convoy protection in the event of war. But even to a naive observer, the fitting of the latest diesel engines, capable of 26 knots and a stunning range of 20,000 miles, required an ulterior motive. Armed with 6 11-inch guns in 2 triple turrets, these vessels were designed to destroy merchant shipping anywhere on the high seas. Even British Admiralty admitted they could be destroyed only by a handful of its most powerful capital ships.
These big German cruisers were called armored cruisers by the Germans, or armored ships, but everyone else says it's a pocket battleship. It's like a little battleship because of the guns. Well, how do you deal with this thing? You can't deal with it with regular cruisers. They don't have the guns, or at least it doesn't seem that way. You got to build a bigger one.
For Germany's neighbours that had suffered in the Great War, the resurrection of its navy was viewed with deep suspicion. The French response was highly provocative. They would build 2 new battleships, even though they could barely afford to do so. The 27,000-ton Dunkirk and her sister ship Strasbourg were twice the tonnage and more than 4 knots faster than Germany's pocket battleships. Their 8 13-inch guns were spread across 2 turrets and offered superior firepower over their German rivals. In 1934, Italy further increased tensions by building 3 powerful battleships. Once completed, the Vittorio Veneto class ships would be capable of 30 knots and be heavily armed with 9 15-inch guns. But at over 41,000 tons, these massive battleships flew in the face of the Washington Treaty limit of 35,000 tons. A dangerous new arms race had begun.
The naval powers decided that they would build these big, expensive monsters because other people were building the big, expensive monsters, and the only thing you could be sure that really could kill the other person's big, expensive monster was a big, expensive monster of your own.
But of all the major naval powers, Japan was the wild card. In the early 1930s, her grievances with the West were plentiful and deep. The United States and Britain were deliberately blocking Japanese trade to their markets, and their colonies in Asia stood in the way of her ambitions for the region. But it was bitterness over further naval limitations forced upon Japan at London in 1930 that finally pushed her to breaking point.
It, in effect, brought down the Japanese government because the Japanese naval minister who was at London, who agreed to sign the treaty, was denounced by the Navy General Staff. The Japanese premier, who had agreed, who also put his imprimatur upon the treaty, was later assassinated at Tokyo, the Tokyo railway station, by a right-wing nationalist, largely because he was seen as somebody who had betrayed Japanese national security.
In 1931, Japan became the only Washington Treaty member to go to war. After annexing Manchuria, she prepared to assert her growing power over China and throughout the Far East.
Today, because of the lust and usurpation of power by her military chieftains, who are bent...
When the League of Nations condemned her aggression, Japan walked out, vowing never to return.
Japan finds herself all alone.
In London in 1935, at another round of naval talks, Japan stunned the meeting. Head of the Imperial Navy, Admiral Yamamoto, proposed the complete abolition of the battleship, the only weapon that could threaten Japan. These ships, he said, are like elaborate religious scrolls which old people hang up in their homes. They are purely a matter of faith, not reality. The battleship, he claimed, was as useful in modern warfare as a samurai sword. But Yamamoto's proposal was dismissed out of hand and Japan withdrew from the talks. The treaties that had kept the world from war were falling apart.
The Japanese quite deliberately destroy the Washington Treaty System to spurt ahead, to maximize their naval strength by the end of the 1930s, so that they can cash in that naval strength to carve out the Great East Asia co-prosperity sphere. One analyst has called this the race to Pearl Harbor.
Unknown to the world, Japan was already planning a new and extraordinary series of battleships. In 1937, at Nagasaki and Kure City, construction began on 2 vessels that would outrange and outgun any warship afloat.
The Japanese were completely committed to this policy of technological superiority. They knew they couldn't outbuild in numbers, so they had to outbuild in quality. And the result was the 2 biggest and most spectacular battleships in the history of navies, Yamato and Musashi.
Once completed, Yamato and Musashi would be almost twice the tonnage of the largest British and American battleships. They would be armed with 9 18-inch guns, the most powerful ever placed aboard a capital ship. They were deemed so sensitive, details of their construction were kept secret, even from the Japanese public.
大和と武蔵っていうものは戦争中は一切国民に知らされておりませんでした。それで新鋭戦艦の写真が出ましたんですけどもね、それは大和武蔵ではなくして利根の三連装砲の従順の利根の写真でありまして、これは巨大戦艦と、嘘の発表をしております。それほど国民にはベールに包まれていたわけですね。
In the late 1930s, there were some intelligence reports, interestingly, that came out of Italy, but seemingly authentic, that the Japanese were introducing some monster new type of battleship with larger guns than were allowed under the expiring international limitations on armament agreements. So this gave some stimulus to the United States to put more capability into its own warships.
With the fracturing of the Washington Treaty and a growing mistrust of Japan, the United States committed itself to a huge capital ship construction program. Between 1937 and 1941, American shipbuilders would lay down 10 fast battleships. The 35,000-ton North Carolina was the first commissioned. Nine 16-inch guns, spread 3 apiece across 3 turrets, would now be the standard armament for all American battleships. With its powerful new battle fleet now under construction, the United States sent Japan a clear message that it would outbuild her, whatever the cost.
The Japanese, who believed that their naval security demanded unfettered naval construction, simply refused to come to grips with the fact that the Americans could ultimately outbuild them.
For Britain, the new naval race was unwelcome. Her shipbuilding and weapons factories had suffered severe cutbacks due to the Washington Treaty. When the agreement terminated, her crippled facilities were revived by an injection of political panic. By 1937, a formidable shipbuilding program was in place, with 2 of 5 King George V class battleships under construction. At 37,000 tons, they would be heavily armoured with belts 15-inch thick. But the rush to build them came at the cost of firepower. The vessels were fitted with 10 14-inch guns, the Admiralty unable to wait an extra year for the manufacture of 16-inch guns, favoured by Japan and the United States. But for Britain, time was the compelling factor. Everywhere she looked, she saw potential enemies. By the mid-1930s, Europe was a boiling cauldron of militarism. In Germany, Adolf Hitler led a new Nazi government. He turned his back on the League of Nations and prepared his people to fashion the future with blood and iron. Soon after he came to power, Hitler further strengthened his navy, regardless of Germany's obligations under the Treaty of Versailles.
Hitler's view basically is, I don't care about treaties, I don't care about limitations, I want the real thing. Hitler is also very much entranced by the romance, if you like, of battleships. They cost the earth, but boy, they're great symbols of national power. So he starts building battleships.
In the late 1930s, the new Reich Navy commissioned two formidable 32,000-ton capital ships, Gneisenau and Scharnhorst. They were armed with 9 11-inch guns, but their ingenious design allowed for later replacement with 15-inch guns. Then in early 1939, Hitler presided over the launch of the two most powerful German capital ships ever built, Bismarck and Tirpitz.
These ships were named after Bismarck and Tirpitz for political reasons, because they demonstrated German strength.
At more than 42,000 tons, Tirpitz and Bismarck would carry 8 15-inch guns and be the best protected warships yet designed. With its stunning new capital ships, Germany had re-emerged in less than 20 years as a major naval power. But Hitler had an even bolder vision for his navy. In 1938, he authorized the construction of a fleet of 8 super battleships, 5 battle cruisers, and 2 aircraft carriers.
In spring 1938, Hitler said to the Navy, well, in the long term, you must prepare for this war situation, and I want to build up a fleet who is able to fight next war against Great Britain.
Plan Z, as it was called, was to be completed by 1944, a year Hitler had earmarked for war. His most ambitious plan was for a battleship to end all battleships. A 144,000-ton nameless giant, more than twice the size of the Japanese Yamato and Musashi. Capable of 34 knots and carrying 8 20-inch guns, this demonically inspired ship, if built, would extinguish all competition and take the battleship into a frightening new realm. But Hitler's startling vision for his navy would only be partly realized. Events of his own making had intervened. In late August 1939, an old German battleship, Schleswig-Holstein, sailed into the Polish harbour of Danzig on a so-called friendly visit. It was to be a turning point in history. 6 days later, without warning, the battleship's guns opened up on Polish fortifications. These shots from an aged battleship signaled the start of the Second World War and the beginning of a naval conflict that would spread to all the world's oceans. For the Phoenix-like German Navy and the men responsible for its resurrection, the darkness of the future had finally arrived.